When my daughter got married, I stayed silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because sometimes silence is sharper than any words. They didn't know the truth that night. Nobody in that grand Charleston ballroom, not even my daughter, knew that I owned $80 million worth of beachfront villas along the Carolina coast. Every beam, every nail, every window had once passed through my hands or my command. I built them. They were my life's work. And yet, that night, I was seated at the far corner of the room, tucked behind a tall column of orchids, as though I were a guest in someone else's celebration. I watched Lydia, my only child, walk into that room, radiant in her gown, the very image of grace and beauty. She was mine, yet I was hidden from view, almost erased from the photographs. When the toast was given, I raised my glass anyway. When the crowd clapped, I clapped too. I smiled at my daughter as though nothing in the world was wrong, but inside me, something cracked. I had been placed as an afterthought at her wedding. That was no accident. Families do not make accidents like that. Still, I kept my silence. My silence was not weakness. It was a choice. I did not stand and declare what I had built. I did not speak of the villas that had taken me 20 years of sweat, broken contracts, storm repairs, and endless labor. I did not remind anyone that I had built houses meant to withstand the fury of wind and salt. Homes that had survived hurricanes, homes that had become my second heartbeat. I said nothing, because I remembered the promise I had made to myself when I finished the last one. No one would take them from me, not without a fight. I thought silence would protect me. I thought silence would keep the peace on my daughter's special day. But little did I know that very silence would soon become my weapon, because just 1 week after that wedding, after the flowers had withered and the champagne glasses had been cleared, my new son-in-law walked into my home with a lawyer at his side. And that's when the truth about my silence and his greed came crashing down. That was the day I realized silence was more than patience. Silence was armor, and it was about to be tested. It was exactly 1 week after the wedding when I heard the knock at my front door. At first I thought it might be Lydia, coming by to bring me leftovers from the reception, or maybe just to sit with her old man the way she used to when her mother was still alive. But when I opened the door, it wasn't my daughter standing there. It was Ethan, my brand new son-in-law. He was dressed sharp, too sharp for an ordinary visit, his smile polished like a salesman who had practiced in the mirror. Beside him stood a man I had never seen before, a lawyer, briefcase in hand, the kind who smelled of expensive ink and false promises. "Dad," Ethan said smoothly, his voice syrupy and rehearsed, "we thought we'd stop by to help you with some paperwork, just to make sure you're safe now that you're living alone." He spoke the word safe as if he owned it, as if safety came from his hand, not from the years of storms I had already survived. I stepped aside and let them into the kitchen. The lawyer slid a folder across my table. On the front, in bold black letters, I saw the words, "Durable Power of Attorney." "It's just a formality," Ethan said, placing his hand lightly on the folder as though he were guiding me toward it. "Lydia and I want to make sure nothing ever goes wrong with the villas, the bank accounts, well, everything you've worked so hard to build. This way, we can take care of things for you." I looked at that folder, then at him. I knew the language of men who hid their hunger behind soft words. I had heard it from bankers, from developers, from partners who once tried to cut me out of my own contracts, and now I was hearing it from my own son-in-law. My spoon slipped against the side of my teacup, the sound ringing sharp in the silence. That sound was enough. I understood in that moment why I had kept quiet at the wedding, why I had never told them about the villas. My silence had protected me from their ambition, and now it would protect me again. I did not sign. I did not even speak. I simply let silence hang heavy in the air until Ethan's smile faltered. He didn't know it yet, but that silence was the start of his undoing. As Ethan and that lawyer sat in my kitchen, waiting for me to pick up the pen, my mind traveled back to the years that had shaped me, to the reason those villas existed in the first place. I wasn't born into money, far from it. I was the son of a dock worker, a man who believed that if you wanted to eat, you worked until your hands bled. I carried that lesson into my own life. I started small, deck repairs, roof replacements, a leaky window here and there. Jobs no one else wanted, jobs that paid just enough to keep a roof over my family's head and food on the table. But I treated every job as if it mattered. I measured twice, cut once, and built like storms were waiting around the corner, because in Charleston, they always were. Over time, word spread. Folks didn't just hire me to fix their homes. They trusted me to build them. That's how I found myself standing on stretches of sand along the Carolina coast, looking out at waves that never stopped testing a man's resolve. I took on contracts most builders wouldn't touch, because I knew something they didn't. Wind and salt are the true test of any wall. It took me 20 years. 20 years of hauling lumber, hammering nails, and battling hurricanes that tried to tear down what I built. 20 years of sweating in the sun, watching the ocean rise and fall, listening to gulls cry above me as I drove foundation stakes deep into the earth. And brick by brick, storm by storm, I created a chain of villas that could stand tall against anything nature threw at them. I called them the houses of wind and salt. Not vacation rentals, not empty investments, homes. Places where families could gather without fear, where laughter could outlast the storm. Each one carried a piece of me, my sweat, my calluses, my stubborn refusal to quit. That's what Ethan wanted to reduce to a folder, to a signature, to paper he could twist into profit. He didn't understand. He couldn't. Those villas weren't just worth $80 million. They were worth my life. So I sat there in my kitchen, silent. Not because I was weak, but because silence, in that moment, reminded me who I was. The man who built walls that stood against the ocean. And I was not about to let a smooth-talking son-in-law tear them down. Ethan's lawyer cleared his throat, tapping the folder like he expected me to break the silence. I didn't. I've spent a lifetime around storms, and I know when to stand still and let the wind burn itself out. My silence grew heavier by the second, and soon it was Ethan who shifted in his seat, his smile tightening like a rope pulled too hard. "Of course, no rush," he said, pretending he was patient. "We'll leave the documents with you. Just think about it." They left soon after, the lawyer's briefcase snapping shut like a trap that hadn't caught its prey. I stood at the window and watched them walk down my drive, their shoulders bent toward each other in hushed conversation. When the car pulled away, I exhaled long and slow, the way I used to after weathering a storm. The house felt different, like it had absorbed their hunger and was pushing it back out through the walls. I sat at my table, hands folded around a cup gone cold. I reached into my pocket and touched the brass key I always carried, the key to the safe that held every deed, every contract, every blueprint I had saved across the years. That key was more than metal. It was my life, my fortress. And I whispered to myself the same words I had repeated through every trial. I will not sign. Not for anyone. Not for any reason. For a moment, I felt the weight of loneliness press down on me. My wife had been gone for years. Lydia was married now, pulled into Ethan's world, and I feared that my silence might cost me her closeness. But then I thought of the alternative. If I signed, if I gave Ethan control, I wouldn't just lose the villas. I would lose myself. I would become a guest in the very legacy I had built. I poured the cold tea into the sink, washed the cup, and placed it neatly back in its spot. Simple order. A reminder that while they plotted, I still stood. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was discipline. It was armor. That night, I slept with the key under my pillow, the way I had when hurricanes threatened to take everything from me. Ethan thought he was clever bringing a lawyer to my door, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. I wasn't just a father. I was a builder, and builders don't surrender what they've built. The morning after Ethan's visit, I heard a knock at my back door, not the sharp rap of a lawyer or the polished tap of someone rehearsing charm. This knock was softer, steady, familiar. I opened it to find Tom, my neighbor of 30 years, holding a mug of black coffee in one hand and yesterday's newspaper in the other. Tom had buried his wife 5 winters ago, and in the silence of our widowers' lives, we had formed a quiet brotherhood. "You had company yesterday," he said, stepping into my kitchen without waiting for permission. His eyes swept the table, sharp as a carpenter's square. He spotted the folder still sitting there, untouched, its bold title visible from across the room. He set his coffee down, leaned on the counter, and let out a low whistle. "Power of attorney," he muttered. "That's no small favor they're asking. You sign that, and you might as well hand them the keys to your life." I stayed quiet, listening. Tom had no family left to circle him, no children to pull him in one direction or another. But he had seen enough men tricked into signing away their land, their savings, their futures. He tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "You know what this is?" he asked. "It's not protection. It's possession. They're not worried about you. They're worried about what you have." I nodded, though I hadn't said it aloud yet. Deep down, I knew he was right. Tom straightened, took a sip of his coffee, and fixed me with a look that had the weight of years behind it. "Don't let silence turn into surrender. Use it as a shield, but get your defenses in order. Paperwork is their weapon, so you fight back with better paperwork." The words landed hard, but true. I had always believed a strong wall could keep out any storm, but Tom was right. This storm wasn't made of wind and salt. It was made of signatures, loopholes, and smooth-talking men in suits. If I didn't prepare, silence alone wouldn't hold. When he left, he slapped the counter once, like a man sealing a promise. "Find a lawyer you can trust," he said, "and don't wait too long. Wolves don't circle forever, they move in." After he was gone, I picked up the folder, turned it over in my hands, and slid it into the safe. Then I locked it away, the brass key heavy in my palm. For the first time, I felt not just the weight of what I had built, but the weight of the battle that was coming. That night, long after Tom's footsteps had faded down the street, I sat at my kitchen table with only the ticking clock for company. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, though I hardly tasted it. The brass key to my safe lay in the center of the table, glinting faintly under the light. I turned it over in my hand, its edges worn smooth from years of carrying it in my pocket. It wasn't just a key. It was everything I had built, everything I still stood for. My thoughts drifted, as they often did, to my late wife, Margaret. She had been the balance to my fire, the soft word when I was too sharp, the steady hand when storms rattled the windows. I could still picture her in this kitchen, humming while she chopped vegetables, laughing when I came home covered in sawdust, telling me, "One day, these houses you're building will be more than walls. They'll be proof." She never lived to see all of them finished. Cancer took her too early, leaving me and Lydia to navigate life without her. For years, Lydia was my anchor. She helped me pick roses from the garden, listened when I told stories about the sea, and even walked with me along the sites where the villas rose from sand into stone. But then she met Ethan. I wanted to trust her choice. Every father does. But even in the early days, I saw how his eyes lingered, not on her, but on the things around her, on the car I drove, the land I owned, the tools neatly stacked in my shed. He asked too many questions about investments, about plans for the future. Lydia was blind to it, blinded by love the way young people often are. I stayed silent then too, hoping she would see for herself one day. Now, watching Ethan walk into my home with a lawyer at his side, I knew Margaret would have seen it instantly. She would have told me what Tom had said that morning. Silence can be armor, but only if it stands behind stronger walls. I sipped my tea and set the cup down carefully, as if the sound might carry through the night. I looked at the key in my hand and felt a surge of resolve. If Ethan wanted a fight, he would have one, but not on his terms, and not with his papers. No, this fight would be on mine. The next morning, I rose before the sun, as I had done all my life. Old habits don't die, even when the work is gone. I made a pot of strong coffee, laced up my boots, and walked out to the porch where the roses my wife planted still clung to the trellis. The air was sharp with salt, the kind that carried memories of storms I had beaten back. I thought about what Tom had said. Wolves don't circle forever, they move in. Ethan's visit had been the first lap, and I knew the next one would come sooner than I wanted. Silence had bought me time, but not safety. I needed more. That's when I remembered James O'Connor. He wasn't flashy, wasn't the kind of lawyer you saw shaking hands at galas. He was steady. A man who worked out of a brick office near the courthouse, with shelves of old law books and a desk that was always cluttered but never careless. Years ago, when I was fighting with a contractor who tried to cheat me out of materials, James was the one who held the line. He didn't raise his voice, didn't grandstand. He simply wrote the right words on the right paper, and the man folded like wet cardboard. Margaret used to say, "James is the kind of man who builds walls out of ink." I found his number still written in my old ledger. My hands didn't shake as I dialed, but my chest felt tight, like the moment before a storm makes landfall. On the second ring, his familiar gravelly voice answered. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, as if no time had passed at all. "I was wondering when you'd call." That gave me pause. "Wondering?" I asked. "Your wife made me promise years ago," he replied. "She told me if anything ever happened to her, and your name came across my phone, I was to drop everything. She knew one day you'd need me again." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Margaret, gone all these years, and yet she had thought this far ahead. My silence cracked, and I let out a breath that carried more than words. "James," I finally said. "I think the wolves are circling." "Then let's build you a fortress," he answered without hesitation. The storm was coming, but for the first time since Ethan darkened my door, I felt ready. James arrived at my house the very next afternoon. No parade, no noise, just his old sedan rolling into the driveway and the steady sound of his shoes on my porch steps. When I opened the door, he gave me a firm nod, carrying a weathered briefcase that looked as battle-tested as he was. "Show me what they brought you," he said without preamble. I led him to the kitchen table, where the folder from Ethan still sat like a snake coiled in waiting. James slipped on his glasses, opened it, and began reading with the patience of a man who had seen every trick before. Page after page, his brow furrowed deeper, and when he finally shut it, the clap of the folder against wood sounded like a gavel. "Broad authority," he muttered. "Immediate effect. No safeguards. If you signed this, they'd own everything. Your villas, your accounts, even decisions about your health. This isn't protection. It's a takeover." I felt my stomach tighten, though I had already suspected as much. James leaned forward, his eyes steady behind those wire frames. "You did the right thing, staying silent. But silence alone won't hold. We need walls higher than theirs." He opened his own briefcase, pulling out neat stacks of forms clipped together. "Here's what we'll do," he continued. "We'll re-record every deed at the county office, refreshing them in your name so no one can slip in a claim through the back door. We'll freeze your credit across all 3 bureaus so they can't borrow against your identity. We'll put a healthcare directive in place naming someone you trust, not Lydia, not Ethan, as your proxy. That way no one can say you're unfit and try to sneak in control." I sat back, listening as though I were hearing blueprints for the first time. Each step he laid out was like a brick, another layer of defense. "This isn't just money," James said firmly. "It's your life's work, your fortress. You built it with lumber and sweat. Now we're going to reinforce it with ink and law." For the first time since Ethan's knock on my door, I felt the ground steady under my feet. This was my language, the language of walls and foundations. I had built homes to withstand storms. Now James was building a fortress to withstand greed. He tapped the folder Ethan had left. "They came here expecting you to be soft, to sign without thinking, but you didn't. That's your strength. Now let's make sure their next attempt breaks against your walls, not through them." I nodded slowly, my jaw set. "Let's build." 2 days after James began setting the fortress in place, I drove into town to pick up a few things: bread, coffee, nails for the shed, the kind of list that makes life steady. I parked beneath an old oak that shaded the back corner of the lot. The air smelled of salt and asphalt, that peculiar mix of coastal city life. As I stepped out of my truck, a voice carried across the rows of cars. I froze. It was Ethan. He stood 3 lanes over, phone pressed to his ear, his back stiff, his shoulders drawn tight. The polished charm he always wore at family gatherings was gone. What I heard was raw, desperate. "Yes, Mom, I know," he said, pacing like a man cornered. "I've already tried the bank. They won't extend us anymore. Numbers don't add up. Without her signature, we're done." Her signature. He meant mine. I ducked behind a cart stall, my heart hammering in my chest. His voice cut sharp across the lot, no longer smooth but jagged, like broken glass. "If he signs the power of attorney, we can refinance the villas, sell a few off quick. That'll cover the debt, keep the company afloat. Without that, it's over." He stopped, his voice dropping low, but I caught every word. "Don't worry, Mom. He's old. He's soft. He won't hold out forever. Lydia will help me push. Between the 2 of us, he won't resist for long." I gripped the handle of the cart so tightly my knuckles whitened. Old. Software words meant to belittle me, to turn me into a pawn in his failing game. Rage surged hot in my chest, but I didn't step forward. I didn't confront him, not yet. I stayed in the shadow, silent as stone, and let him spill every truth he'd tried to hide behind polished smiles. When his car finally pulled away, I stood in the quiet lot, the world moving around me like nothing had happened, children laughing, carts rattling, seagulls crying overhead. But everything had changed. Ethan's mask had slipped. His marriage to my daughter wasn't just about love, it was about survival. He needed me, not for who I was, but for what I had built. I walked into the store, picked up the bread and nails like any other man, but inside I carried something heavier, the proof that Ethan's kindness was a costume and his desperation was the storm pressing against my walls. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had slipped behind the horizon. The roses outside swayed in the wind, their shadows stretching long across the walls. On the table before me lay the brass key, the same one that unlocked the safe holding every deed, every proof of my labor. I rolled it between my fingers, heavy and steady, while Ethan's words replayed in my head like a curse. Old software won't hold out for long. I thought of Lydia, my daughter, my pride, the child Margaret and I had raised with bedtime stories and Sunday walks on the beach. I remembered her as a little girl, chasing gulls along the sand, her laughter rising above the waves. I remembered holding her hand on her first day of school, steadying her when her knees shook. I remembered the tears in her eyes when Margaret passed, and how she clung to me like I was the only solid thing left in her world. And now, she was bound to Ethan. She had chosen him. I could almost hear her voice echoing his lines, soft but rehearsed. "We only want to take care of you, Dad. It's for your safety." She believed him, at least enough to let him lead. That truth cut sharper than anything Ethan had said in the parking lot. Because what he wanted most wasn't just the villas, it was my daughter's trust. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't empty. It pressed in around me, asking the question I dreaded most. If I stood firm, would I lose her? Would she look at me as the obstacle, the enemy, the old man standing in the way of her husband's dreams? I wanted to protect her the way I always had. But protecting her didn't mean surrendering the legacy I had built with my own hands. Margaret's voice echoed in me as if she were still here. Don't mistake surrender for love. Boundaries are proof of love, too. The kettle whistled faintly on the stove. I rose, poured myself a cup, and set another across from me, as I often did out of habit. The empty chair stared back, and I whispered into the stillness, "Lydia, I love you enough to say no." The words hung in the air like bricks settling into place. Painful, necessary, immovable. It was 3 days after I overheard Ethan's phone call when the sound of tires crunched across my gravel drive. I watched from the window as Lydia stepped out first, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. Ethan followed close behind, his palm resting lightly on her back like he was guiding her forward, though I could see he was pushing. They rang the bell twice before I opened the door. "Dad?" Lydia said softly, her eyes darting to the roses along the porch, as though they could explain the tension in the air. "We thought we'd stop by, just to check on you." Ethan's smile returned, that polished mask he wore in public. "We worry about you, sir. Alone in this big house. The villas, the accounts. It's a lot of responsibility. Lydia and I just want to lighten the load." I stepped aside, motioning them in. They settled at my kitchen table, the same place Ethan's lawyer had tried his trick. I set cups in front of them, poured tea, and sat down without a word. Ethan spread his hands across the wood as if staking claim to the space. "Think how much simpler life could be if we handled the details. You could travel, join clubs, relax. Let us take care of the business side. It isn't about money, it's about family." Family. He said the word like it was a key to unlock any door. But I heard the calculation behind it, the same tone I'd heard in the parking lot. Lydia reached for my hand, her voice trembling. "Dad, please, we only want what's best for you." I stirred my tea, the spoon clicking against porcelain, steady and deliberate. The silence stretched across the table, thick as a storm cloud. Ethan shifted, cleared his throat, tried again. "It's just a formality, a signature, nothing more." Still, I said nothing. I let the silence hang heavy, let it press against them harder than any words could. Lydia's grip on my hand faltered. Ethan leaned back, frustration flickering in his eyes. Finally, I set my spoon down and spoke only one sentence, calm and measured. "I'll think about it. Not a promise, not a concession, just enough to end the performance." They exchanged glances. Lydia's full of hope, Ethan's shadowed by impatience. They rose, leaving their cups untouched. "We'll check back soon," he said, his tone carrying the weight of inevitability. When the door closed behind them, I stood in the quiet. My silence had unsettled them, and in that silence, I realized I had drawn my line. The morning after Lydia and Ethan left my kitchen, I drove to James's office downtown. His building was nothing fancy, just a brick townhouse near the courthouse, its paint faded, its door brass worn from years of steady use. But inside, I knew real defenses were being drawn. James greeted me with the same calm presence he always carried, no wasted words, no false charm. His desk was cluttered with files, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "They've pressed you again?" he asked. I nodded. "Together this time." She held my hand while he spoke. "They want me to believe it's about family." James leaned back, the faintest sigh escaping. "Family is the word greedy men use when they want free access to your life. Don't mistake it for loyalty." He pulled a stack of forms from his drawer and slid them across the table. "These are the deeds to every villa. We'll re-record them with the county. Fresh filings, clear and current. That way, even if they try something, the law will stand in your favor. Then we freeze your credit with all 3 bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, Experian. That will keep them from opening accounts in your name. We'll also establish a healthcare directive, naming someone you trust as proxy, someone who won't bend under pressure." I looked at the paper, the official seals, the lines waiting for my signature. They reminded me of blueprints spread across a workbench. Each page was a wall, a beam, a foundation. "This will be enough?" I asked quietly. "Enough and more," James replied. "By the time we're done, they won't be able to lift a finger against you without tripping alarms. You'll not only hold the fortress, you'll know every gate and key by heart." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't tremble. Each stroke of my name felt like driving a nail into fresh lumber, steady and sure. When James stamped the first document, the sound rang deep, not like defeat, but like a drumbeat. A wall going up. We worked in silence for over an hour. Deeds, directives, freezes, letters. By the end, a fortress stood on paper, as solid as any villa I had ever built by hand. James gathered the stack neatly into his briefcase. "Now," he said firmly, "when they come again, and they will, you don't answer with words. You answer with walls." I nodded, the brass key heavy in my pocket, my silence heavier still. It didn't take long for Ethan to return. A man drowning doesn't wait politely. He thrashes, desperate for anything to cling to. Late one afternoon, his car pulled up the drive again. This time he came alone. No Lydia, no lawyer, just Ethan with his tie loosened and his charm wearing thin. He knocked hard on the door, sharp raps that rattled the frame. When I opened it, he plastered on that smile of his, but the edges were cracking. "Sir," he said, too cheerful, "thought I'd stop by, just to see how you're doing." I let him in, said nothing. He followed me to the kitchen, sat down at the table as though it were already his. His eyes darted toward the safe in the hallway, though he tried to mask it by adjusting his cuffs. "You know," he began, "Lydia worries about you. Says you're working too hard to manage all that property. I keep telling her we can help. You've carried this burden long enough." I poured myself a cup of tea, set the pot down, and left his cup empty. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. He shifted in his chair, leaned forward, his voice lower now. "Look, let's be honest. This is more than you can handle. Taxes, maintenance, tenants. It's too much for one man. If you'd just sign, just give us the authority, you could finally rest. Isn't that what you want?" I stirred my tea, the spoon clicking steady against the porcelain. Click, click. The rhythm filled the space between us. His jaw tightened. Finally, his smile slipped. "Why are you being so difficult? We're family. Don't you trust me?" That word again, family, used like a crowbar. I met his eyes for the first time since he walked in, calm, steady, unblinking, and I said nothing. The silence unsettled him more than any argument could have. He shifted again, cleared his throat, his confidence fraying at the edges. "All right," he muttered, standing abruptly. "Think about it, but don't take too long. These things, they don't wait forever." I rose slowly, walked him to the door, and held it open without a word. He stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, his shoulders tight. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the quiet, the brass key pressing against my leg through my pocket. Ethan was slipping, his mask was cracking, and my silence was the hammer that split it wide open. It was just 2 evenings later when I saw a smaller car ease into my driveway. I pulled back the curtain and felt my chest tighten. Lydia. She stepped out slowly, clutching her purse against her chest like a shield. She walked up the path with hesitant steps, her eyes red as if she'd been crying long before she arrived. When I opened the door, she whispered, "Dad, can we talk?" Her voice cracked on the last word. I let her in. She sat at the kitchen table, the same place where battles with Ethan had already played out, but she looked nothing like him. No polish, no practiced lines, just raw, unsteady emotion. I poured her tea, set the cup in front of her, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. "Why don't you trust me?" she blurted. "Why won't you believe I only want to help you? You've trusted me my whole life. Why not now?" Her tears came hard and fast, streaking her face. Every memory of her childhood rose up in me at once. Her tiny hand in mine when she took her first steps, the way she clung to me after Margaret's funeral, the sound of her laughter running barefoot along the beach. My instinct was to reach across, to gather her in my arms and promise her everything would be fine. But I stopped. My hand froze halfway, then settled back on my cup. "Lydia," I said softly, "I do trust you. I've trusted you every day of your life, but trust isn't the same as signing." She flinched as if the words cut her. "So you don't love me anymore?" I leaned forward, steady, deliberate. Boundaries aren't the absence of love. They are how love survives without being twisted. If I sign, I lose more than villas. I lose the chance to be your father. I'd become your burden, your bank, your responsibility. By saying no, I'm still being your father. I'm loving you the only way I can. Her lip trembled. Ethan says... I cut her off gently. Ethan says many things, but I've heard him when he thought no one was listening. He's not worried about me. He's worried about his debts. Her breath caught. She looked down, fingers twisting at the strap of her purse. Silence filled the room, but this silence was different, painful, heavy, necessary. At last she whispered, "I don't know how to feel." I reached for my cup, the porcelain warm under my palm. "You don't have to know today, but remember this. My silence is not rejection. It's protection." After Lydia left, the house felt heavier than it had in years. The roses brushed against the window outside, but their gentle sound only reminded me how quiet the inside had become. I sat at the table, her untouched teacup still steaming between us, and felt the ache in my chest. I had stood firm, just as I promised myself I would, but the cost was written in the tears on my daughter's face. I reached into the drawer of my desk and pulled out a stack of stationery I hadn't touched in months. Margaret had loved letter writing. She used to leave little notes in my lunchbox when I was out on job sites, short sentences that reminded me to come home with more than just exhaustion. Maybe that's why, since her passing, I'd started writing to her. Not letters meant to be sent, but letters meant to carry the weight I couldn't share with anyone else. I uncapped my pen and began. "Margaret, tonight, I feel both strong and broken. I kept my promise. I didn't sign, but it feels like I paid for it with my daughter's trust." She looked at me across this table and asked if I loved her. I wanted to hold her, to tell her that love is why I'm saying no, but she couldn't hear it. Not yet. She only hears Ethan's voice, telling her lies wrapped in the word family. The pen scratched slowly, each word heavier than the last. "Do you know what hurts the most? Not Ethan's greed, not the paper he tried to slide across this table. What hurts is the look in Lydia's eyes, like I'm her enemy. I never imagined that protecting her could feel like betrayal. And yet, if I yield, if I sign, I'll lose myself and her in the same breath. You told me once that silence can be armor. I'm learning that's true. But Margaret, armor is heavy, and tonight it feels heavier than I can carry alone." I stopped, staring at the ink that blurred where a tear had fallen. For a long time, I sat there with my hand on the page, whispering into the quiet as though she were sitting across from me. "I'm trying," I said softly. "I'm keeping the fortress, but it's lonely without you." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the drawer with the others. A silent diary of grief, promises, and battles fought with ink instead of nails. Then I touched the brass key in my pocket, reminding myself, armor may be heavy, but it's worth carrying. 2 mornings after Lydia's visit, I drove back to James's office. The streets were just waking up, delivery trucks at the curbs, shopkeepers rolling up their doors. But inside that brick townhouse, it felt like stepping into a command post. Papers lined his desk, each one a soldier ready to take its place. James greeted me with a nod, no wasted time on pleasantries. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Bad enough," I admitted, lowering myself into the chair across from him. "She came alone this time, tears in her eyes. Told me I didn't trust her." James set his glasses on the desk and leaned back, his voice steady. She's torn. That's not her voice. It's his echo. You can't fight her with anger. You fight with structure. Show her where the lines are, then let her decide which side she'll stand on. He pulled a folder from the stack and slid it toward me. Here are the updated deeds, freshly recorded. Chain of title airtight. If Ethan tries to tamper with them, the county clerk will see it before the ink dries. He opened another file. We've also got the freezes in place with the credit bureaus. They can't borrow a dime in your name. And here? He tapped a crisp set of papers. A healthcare directive naming Tom as your proxy. He's steady, and he won't bend. Ethan can scream family all he wants, but when it comes to your health, the law won't give him standing. I turned the pages slowly, absorbing each line the way I used to study blueprints. Every signature, every seal felt like a brick being laid, a wall rising higher. James watched me carefully. They'll come back. Desperate people always do. But now, every path they try leads back here, through me, through the law. You don't answer the door with explanations. You hand them my card. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For weeks, it had felt like I was standing alone, bracing against a storm with nothing but my own silence. But here, across from James, I realized I wasn't carrying the armor alone anymore. Thank you, I said quietly. James gave the faintest smile. You built villas that stood against hurricanes. Let me build paperwork that stands against men like Ethan. Between us, nothing breaks through. When I left his office, the sun was higher, the air sharper. For the first time in days, I felt taller. My silence was still my weapon, but now it was backed by walls no one could climb. It was a Friday afternoon when the storm finally broke. Tires screeched on my gravel drive, spitting rocks against the rose bushes. I watched through the lace curtain as Ethan stepped out of his car, his face tight, his phone clutched in one hand like a weapon. He didn't bring Lydia this time, nor a lawyer, nor a smile. He brought his temper. The knock rattled the door so hard the frame shook. Open up, he barked. This is ridiculous. I didn't rush. I walked down the hallway at my own pace, my boots steady on the floorboards. I stopped behind the door, but didn't unlock it. Ethan, I said calmly, if you need something, you can speak with James O'Connor. All business goes through him now. Silence followed, then his laughter, short, sharp, mean. A lawyer? You think some paper pusher will protect you? You're old, Marlowe. You don't understand how the world works anymore. Without us, you'll drown in paperwork. You'll end up broke, confused, alone. The brass key in my pocket grew warmer, as if Margaret herself was pressing it into my hand. I steadied my voice. I'm not confused, and this conversation is over. He slammed his fist against the door, the wood reverberating like thunder. Do you know how much trouble you're causing? Lydia's miserable. The company's hanging by a thread because you won't help. Do you want your own daughter ruined? Is that what you want? My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. I pressed my palm against the door, drawing a line that no fist could break. If Lydia's miserable, I said firmly, it's because of the choices you've made, not mine. The handle rattled once, twice, like he might try to force it. My heart pounded in my chest, but the lock held, and so did I. Finally, I heard his heavy steps retreat down the porch. A car door slammed, the engine roared, and gravel sprayed as he tore away. I stayed by the door long after the sound faded, my forehead resting lightly against the wood. The threshold had never felt more real, a line dividing desperation from dignity. On one side, Ethan's anger clawed for entry. On the other, my silence held. When I finally stepped back, the house seemed taller, sturdier, as if it too had stood its ground. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward, like a quiet victory. The storm had pounded on my door and found no entry. After Ethan's car screeched out of my drive, the silence in the house pressed down heavy, like the calm after a hurricane. I stood at the window, watching the roses sway under the dust his tires had kicked up. They bent, but they did not break. I wondered if the same would be true for Lydia. I walked back to the kitchen, poured a cup of tea, and set another across from me. Old habit, Margaret's cup. I found myself staring at the empty chair, wishing she were still here to tell me if I was doing the right thing. I'd faced plenty of storms in my life, but none like this. Boards and nails I understood. Anger and betrayal, not so much. I thought of Ethan's words. Lydia's miserable. Do you want her ruined? It was a cheap tactic, but it landed like a blow all the same. Because the truth was, Lydia was suffering. She loved him. even if his love for her was tangled with desperation. And now she was caught in the crossfire, pulled between the man she married and the father who raised her. I took the brass key from my pocket and turned it over in my hand. It was smooth from years of carrying it, a reminder of everything I'd built. Margaret had told me once, the villas aren't just your work, they're your proof. They show what kind of man you are. If I signed them away, I wouldn't just be giving up property. I'd be erasing proof of my life. But if Lydia walked away from me because I refused, what proof of fatherhood would I have left? The question gnawed at me. Could silence, even as armor, also drive her farther away? Was I protecting her or pushing her into Ethan's arms? I set the key down on the table and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. I remembered her laughter as a child, running barefoot across the sand while I hammered beams into place. Back then, storms were simple. We boarded up windows, tied down tarps, and prayed the house would hold. But family storms? They didn't pass so quickly. I whispered into the empty room, not sure if I was speaking to Margaret, to myself, or to God. Let her see the truth before it's too late. The tea had grown cold by the time I opened my eyes again. Ethan's fury had proven one thing. He was running out of moves, but the cost of holding my line was still unclear, and the only person who could decide that was Lydia. A week after Ethan's angry visit, an envelope arrived by courier. Heavy stock, expensive ink, stamped with a law firm's name I didn't recognize. I slid it open at the counter, the roses swaying outside my window, as if leaning in to watch. Inside was a neatly typed letter, formal, polite, and dripping with intimidation. Mr. Marlowe, it read, as your son-in-law and daughter are deeply concerned for your well-being, we urge you to sign the attached power of attorney to ensure your affairs are handled responsibly. Failure to do so may result in further legal action. I chuckled under my breath. They thought words on paper would scare me, but they didn't know I'd built stronger walls with James. I picked up the phone and called him immediately. He answered on the first ring. Let me guess, he said, his tone wry. Fancy letter, expensive stationery, threatening tone? Exactly, I replied, with an attachment that looks just like the one Ethan shoved across my table. Good, James said. That means they're desperate enough to tip their hand. Send it over. I'll draft the response. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one bore James's return address. I opened it slowly, savoring the weight of his words. It was sharp, precise, and final. My client, Mr. Marlowe, has no intention of signing away his rights or property. Any further attempts to coerce or intimidate him will be met with legal consequences. Consider this your notice to cease all such efforts. Reading those words felt like watching a wall rise brick by brick. Ethan might rage, his lawyers might bluster, but now the battlefield wasn't my kitchen table, it was the courthouse, and in that arena I had James. That evening I walked down to the shore. The waves rolled in heavy, crashing against the sand like fists against a door. I thought of Ethan's knock, his anger, his threats, all sound and fury like the sea in a storm. But storms always pass, and what's built on solid foundations endures. I picked up a stone, turned it in my palm, then dropped it into the surf. Paper, I murmured, when wielded right, becomes stone. For the first time in weeks, I felt not just defended, but victorious. Ethan had thrown his weight at my walls and found them unmovable. The villas stood, my name stood, and my silence, backed by ink and law, was louder than any threat he could send. It wasn't long after James's letter went out that the ripples reached Lydia. She came by unannounced one evening, her face pale, her shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight too heavy for her frame. I ushered her in, poured her tea, and waited. She didn't touch the cup. He's furious, she whispered, staring down at her trembling hands. Ethan says you've humiliated him, that by hiring a lawyer, you've turned this into a war. I took a slow sip of my own tea before answering. It became a war the moment he brought a lawyer into my house. I didn't start this, Lydia. I'm only protecting what's mine. Her eyes lifted, glossy with tears. He says you don't trust me, that you're choosing to believe a stranger over your own daughter. The words cut, but I recognized them for what they were. Not hers, but his. I leaned forward, steady and calm. James isn't a stranger. He's been protecting this family longer than Ethan has even known our names. Your mother trusted him. So do I. She shook her head, torn. He's been different lately, short-tempered. He shouts when things don't go his way. I thought, I thought marriage would make him stronger, calmer. But the pressure. She stopped, pressing her lips together, as if she had already said too much. I reached across the table and laid my hand over hers. Pressure doesn't create cracks, Lydia. It only reveals them. Ethan's mask is slipping, and you're starting to see what's underneath. That isn't your fault. But it is your choice what you do with it. Her fingers tightened around mine, fragile and desperate. I don't want to choose between you. I want peace. I nodded slowly. So do I. But peace doesn't come from surrendering to someone else's greed. It comes from building boundaries strong enough to protect love inside them. For a long moment, she just sat there, silent except for the sound of her breathing. Then softly she asked, "What if he doesn't stop?" I withdrew my hand, folded it calmly around the brass key in my pocket. Then he'll learn that some walls can't be moved, no matter how hard he pushes. When she left that night, I watched her drive away, her tail lights flickering red down the long gravel road. My heart ached for her, caught in a marriage already straining under cracks. But for the first time, I saw the smallest flicker of doubt in her eyes, a flicker that might one day burn through Ethan's lies. The storm came back on a Tuesday morning, not with thunder or rain, but with another letter. This one wasn't dressed in polite language. It carried accusations, incapacitated, unfit, unable to manage affairs. Ethan had filed for guardianship. If the court believed him, he'd gain full control of everything I owned. I sat at the table, the paper trembling, only because my hands clenched it so tightly. For a moment, anger roared in me hotter than any storm I had ever braced against. This wasn't just greed anymore. It was war. He was trying to erase me while I was still alive. I called James immediately. His calm voice steadied me like the weight of stone. "Don't worry," he said. "They can't prove what isn't true. You're healthy, sound, and fully capable. We'll crush this before it even breathes." True to his word, James prepared everything. Medical evaluations, financial records, notarized affidavits, all stamped, signed, and sealed. By the time we walked into the courthouse, we weren't just defending, we were armed to the teeth. The hearing was short. Ethan sat on one side, his lawyer spouting claims about my supposed confusion, my supposed inability to handle responsibility. But when the judge asked me questions, direct, pointed, I answered each one clear, steady, deliberate. Not a tremor in my voice, not a gap in my memory. I spoke of every villa by name, recited dates of construction, storms survived, deeds filed. I looked the judge square in the eye and told him, "I built these homes with my own hands. I've managed them for decades, and I'm not about to hand them over because my son-in-law wants an easy payday." Ethan's lawyer tried to argue, but James rose, his voice firm as granite. He laid out the fresh filings, the frozen credit, the healthcare directive, layer upon layer of proof that I was not only capable, but already defended. By the time the gavel fell, the petition was dismissed. Ethan sat rigid in his chair, his face flushed with fury and humiliation. Lydia sat behind him, pale, her eyes wide as though she'd seen behind his curtain at last. As I walked out of that courthouse with James at my side, the brass key heavy in my pocket, I felt taller than I had in years. Ethan had thrown everything at me, sweet words, anger, lawyers, even the court. But the fortress held, and for the first time I realized he had nothing left. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp with the smell of rain on hot pavement. People spilled down the steps, some talking in low voices, others hurrying back to their cars. I walked slowly, each step steady, the brass key pressing firm in my pocket like a reminder of who I was. James peeled off to take a call, leaving me at the top of the stairs. That's when I saw him. Ethan stood at the bottom, his tie askew, his face red with anger he could no longer hide. Lydia hovered behind him, her hands twisted together, her eyes darting between us like a sparrow caught between storms. "You think you've won?" Ethan spat as I approached. His voice cracked, loud enough that heads turned. "You embarrassed me in there, made me look like a fool. But this isn't over, old man. You can't keep this up forever." I stopped 2 steps above him, tall enough to look down without leaning. For a moment I said nothing, just silence. And that silence stretched until the crowd around us thinned, until even Lydia's breathing seemed to falter. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, low, but sharp enough to cut. You tried charm. You tried threats. You tried lawyers and courts. And every time you failed. Do you know why, Ethan? He sneered. Because you're stubborn? No, I said, shaking my head. Because I built walls stronger than your greed. My villas stand because I knew storms would come. And I stand because I knew men like you would too. You'll break against me, just like waves against stone. For the first time his mask slipped completely. The bravado drained, leaving only desperation. His hands trembled, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward Lydia as if searching for backup. But she didn't move. She only looked at me, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. And in that silence I saw it, the seed of doubt blooming in her heart. I stepped down one more stair, close enough that he had to tilt his head to meet my eyes. You can rage, you can scheme, you can circle this house 100 more times, but you'll never cross the threshold. Not while I'm alive. Not ever. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came. He turned sharply, storming toward the car. Lydia lingered for one heartbeat more, her eyes locked on mine, full of questions she couldn't yet ask. Then she followed him, leaving me on the steps with nothing but the sound of my own silence, and the strength of knowing it had spoken louder than his fury ever could. Days passed after the courthouse battle, and for a while the air was strangely still. Ethan didn't show up at my door, didn't send letters, didn't even try to call. But silence like that doesn't come from peace. It comes from retreat. I knew he was licking his wounds, plotting his next angle. What I didn't expect was who would come to me first. It was Lydia. She arrived one late afternoon, her car pulling gently into the drive. No screech of tires, no tension on her face, just weariness. She stepped out slowly, like a woman carrying invisible chains. When I opened the door, she didn't wait to be invited in. She walked straight to the kitchen, sat at the table, and let out a breath that seemed to deflate her completely. I don't know how much longer I can do this, she whispered. I poured her tea, set it in front of her, and said nothing. Silence gave her the space to fill. She twisted her hands together, then looked at me with eyes full of conflict. He's different now, not just with you, with me. Angry all the time, short-tempered. He blames me for the court. Says I should have convinced you. Says I'm weak for not standing harder on his side. Her voice broke, and my heart clenched. I reached across, not to persuade this time, but simply to steady her trembling hand. Lydia, I said softly, storms don't change a man. They reveal him. What you're seeing now has always been there. You just couldn't see it through the shine. She swallowed hard, tears brimming. I wanted to believe he married me for love, but I think he married me for what you built. The words hung in the air, sharp as nails driven into fresh wood. She had spoken what I'd feared all along, but hearing it from her lips was both pain and relief. I never wanted this fight for you, I said gently. All I wanted was to protect you, even if it meant you hating me for a while. But if you see it now, if you truly see him, then maybe the storm has done its work. Her tears spilled, but she nodded, a small, fragile motion. For the first time in months, I saw clarity beginning to edge into her eyes. When she left that evening, she hugged me tighter than she had since her wedding. She said nothing, but she didn't need to. Sometimes silence carries more truth than words ever could. After Lydia's visit, the house felt lighter somehow. Not because the storm had passed completely, but because the winds had shifted. For months, I had carried the weight of silence like armor, wondering if it would only push her farther away. But now, for the first time, I saw what Margaret must have known all along. Patience isn't passive. It's powerful. I walked through the villas the next morning, each one standing tall against the coastline like a sentinel. The walls smelled faintly of salt and cedar. The floors creaked with the sound of memory. Families had lived here, laughed here, survived storms behind the protection of these beams. These homes had proven themselves strong, and in them I saw my own reflection. Patience had been my hammer, silence had been my chisel, and with them I had carved a life that no wave, no storm, no desperate man could break. I stood on one balcony, the ocean stretching endless before me, gulls wheeling overhead. The tide rolled in, relentless, crashing against the shore only to retreat again. That was Ethan, loud, forceful, constant, but always retreating when he met resistance. I didn't need to fight him with fists or shouts. I I only needed to stand, steady and unmoved, until his waves broke against me. Later that day, Tom came by, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He leaned on the porch rail, watching the roses bend in the breeze. "Heard about court," he said. "You held the line." I nodded. "With James's help." Tom smirked. "And your own backbone. Paper only works if the man behind it won't fold." He sipped his coffee, then added, "Most men your age would have signed just to keep peace at the table. But peace built on surrender isn't peace. It's defeat." His words settled in me like stones laid in mortar. That was the truth. Peace isn't bought by giving up what you've built. Peace is earned by protecting it, even when it costs you sleepless nights and a daughter's tears. As the sun dipped low, I found myself back at my table, the brass key warm in my palm. For months, it had been my symbol of resistance. Now, it felt like more than that. It was proof of endurance, of patience, of love that knew how to say no. I whispered into the quiet, as if Margaret could hear me. "The storm didn't take us, love. We're still standing." It was a quiet Sunday morning when Lydia came again. No Ethan this time, just her small car pulling slowly into the drive, the crunch of gravel under her tires soft instead of sharp. I opened the door before she could knock, and for a moment we just stood there, father and daughter, the ocean breeze stirring the air between us. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in months. Inside, she settled at the table, and this time she reached for the teacup before I poured. She cradled it in both hands, the steam rising against her face. For a long while she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she confessed, "I think you were right." My heart clenched. I didn't move, didn't press. I let her words find their own weight in the silence. "He's not the man I thought he was," she continued, her eyes fixed on the steam curling from her cup. "The more pressure he feels, the more cruel he becomes, not just with you, with me. He blames me for every failure, for every door that closes. And last night, he said things no husband should say." Her voice broke, and tears welled in her eyes. I wanted to rage, to stand and drive across town and tear him from her life with my own hands. But I held still, steady as stone. That wasn't my battle. This was hers to see, hers to choose. "You don't need to explain, Lydia," I said gently. "Storms reveal what was always there. Now you know." She wiped at her cheeks, nodding slowly. "I thought if I pushed you, if I begged you to sign, maybe he would calm down. But I see now, it wouldn't have been enough. He would have taken everything, and then hated me for it." At last, she lifted her eyes to mine. "You didn't sign, you never wavered, and because of that, I can finally see him clearly." I reached across the table, this time not to resist but to embrace. She gripped my hand tight, her tears falling freely now, not from anger but from release. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "There's nothing to be sorry for," I replied, squeezing her hand. "You're my daughter. That's forever. Love doesn't vanish in storms. It waits for the sky to clear." For the first time since her wedding day, Lydia smiled at me through her tears, and in that fragile, luminous moment, I felt the tide finally turning homeward. The weeks that followed were calmer. Ethan's visits stopped, his letters stopped. Even his shouting in public seemed to fade into whispers. Word around town was that his company was failing fast, debts piling up, partners pulling away. Without my signature, without access to the villas, he had nothing left to prop himself up. I didn't celebrate. Storms don't deserve celebration. They deserve vigilance. But every morning as I walked along the rows of roses Margaret had planted, I felt the air grow lighter. The fortress had held. Lydia came often now, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but her company. She would sit at the kitchen table, sipping tea in the chair her mother once favored, telling me small stories about her work, her friends, her dreams. And though her marriage still bound her, I could see the strings fraying. She laughed less when she spoke of Ethan. She leaned more into the silence of our home, where she didn't have to perform. One evening, as the sun fell gold across the horizon, she asked me, "Dad, do you ever regret staying quiet all those months? Not shouting, not warning, not fighting louder?" I turned the brass key in my palm, feeling its familiar weight. "No," I said simply, "because silence isn't weakness, it's control. It's knowing when to hold your ground and let the storm waste itself against you. Words can be twisted, silence cannot." She nodded, her eyes soft, her hand reaching for mine. For the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt my family beginning to heal. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough. That night, I sat alone on the porch, the ocean whispering in the distance. The villas stood strong along the coast, my proof against every storm. And I realized that my revenge hadn't been in anger, or in shouting, or even in winning at court. My revenge had been silence itself, silence that exposed greed, silence that revealed truth, silence that protected what mattered most. I smiled into the night air, whispering softly as if Margaret could hear, "We're still standing, love, and that's enough." If you found wisdom in this story, if you believe silence can be the sharpest form of revenge, then join me again for more tales of strength, family, and justice. Subscribe to Wise Revenge and never miss the stories that remind us. Storms may rage, but walls built with love and patience will always endure.